The badge scanner beeped red for the third time, and nobody in the break room even looked up. David Marsh stood at the door with his lunch bag in one hand and his daughter's crayon drawing taped inside the flap of his jacket pocket, the way he always carried a piece of her with him on hard days. He tried the scanner again. Red. A ripple of laughter came from the corner table, where Trent Colby was holding court over a half-eaten sandwich, the kind of laugh that wasn't really about anything funny. It was about being watched, being cruel, and enjoying the audience. "System's probably confused," Trent said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Doesn't know what to do with a guy who still uses a flip phone." David didn't have a flip phone. He had, in fact, 3 patents and a net worth that would have silenced the room instantly if anyone had bothered to ask. But no one asked. No one ever asked the man who mopped up their assumptions along with everything else. He smiled the way he always smiled at moments like this, small, unreadable, unbothered, and swiped his badge a third time. It clicked green. He stepped through without a word, and if anyone had studied his face closely, they might have noticed that his eyes weren't on Trent at all. They were on the security camera mounted above the vending machine, its lens angled just slightly toward the break room table. He knew, because he had asked for it to be angled that way, 3 weeks earlier. 2 floors up, in an office with glass walls and a view of the harbor, Elena Cross sat down her tablet and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She had just finished watching the same footage twice. "Pull the last 2 weeks," she said to the man standing across from her desk. "Every camera on that floor." "I want a full log by Friday." The man nodded and left without asking why. He had worked for Cross Dynamics long enough to know that when the CEO's voice went that quiet, it wasn't a request. It was the sound of a decision being made. 3 weeks before that morning, David Marsh had walked into the Cross Dynamics Logistics building for the first time, carrying a badge that read Temporary Warehouse Associate and nothing else. No title, no history. No warning to the 60 employees on that floor that the quiet man in the gray jacket had been sent there by the company's board of directors, at the personal request of Elena Cross herself, to do something that had never been attempted in the company's 22-year history. He was there to find out from the inside whether Cross Dynamics deserved to survive its own culture. The company had grown fast, too fast, some said, swallowing 3 smaller logistics firms in 18 months, absorbing their staff, their systems, their bad habits, and never quite finding the time to ask what kind of place it was becoming. Employee complaints had tripled. Turnover in the warehouse division was the worst in the company's history. HR had a drawer full of exit interviews that all said some version of the same thing, worded carefully enough to avoid a lawsuit, honest enough to make Elena's stomach turn every time she read them. She could have hired a consulting firm. She could have sent auditors with clipboards and lanyards, the kind everyone recognizes and performs politeness for exactly as long as they're in the room. Instead, she had made 1 phone call to a man she had known for 11 years, a man she trusted with problems too important to hand to strangers. "I need someone who won't be seen," she had told him, "not a spy. Just someone who can watch a place the way it actually is, not the way it pretends to be when the cameras are obvious." David had said yes before she finished the sentence. He always did when it mattered. What almost nobody at Cross Dynamics knew, what only Elena and 2 members of the board knew, was that David Marsh wasn't simply an old colleague doing a favor. He was, as of 4 months earlier, the majority shareholder of the private equity fund that had just completed a controlling investment in Cross Dynamics itself. His signature was on the papers that had kept 300 jobs from being cut during the last restructuring. His decision, still 6 weeks from being finalized, would determine whether the fund extended further capital to save the struggling logistics division or pulled out entirely and let it collapse under its own culture. He hadn't come to watch numbers. Numbers were easy to fake for 30 days. He had come to watch people, because people were much harder to fake and much easier to break. On his first morning, he introduced himself only as David, shook hands with his new supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Preston Doyle, who ran the warehouse floor with the practiced charm of someone who had learned exactly how to sound supportive in front of superiors, and how to sound different the moment they left. "We've had a lot of tong come through," Preston said, clapping him once on the shoulder. "Most don't last the month. But hey, maybe you'll surprise us." David only nodded. He had learned, over many years of sitting across negotiating tables from men exactly like Preston, that the fastest way to understand someone was to give them nothing to perform against. Silence made people show you who they were because they assumed silence meant no one was paying attention. He was wrong about one thing only. He assumed it would take weeks to see the real shape of the place. It took 4 days. On the 4th day, a shipment came in mislabeled, an error that had clearly originated upstream in receiving, nowhere near David's station. Preston needed someone to blame in the morning meeting because the regional director was joining by video call and Preston's numbers were already thin that quarter. He chose David, the new guy, the quiet one, the one with no allies in the room to push back. New associate mixed up the manifest codes, Preston said smoothly, not even glancing over. We're addressing it. David said nothing. He didn't correct him. He didn't defend himself. He simply wrote the date, the shipment number, and Preston's exact words in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, the same pocket that held his daughter's drawing, and he went back to work. It would become a habit. Not out of bitterness. David had long since stopped being the kind of man who let small cruelties live in his chest overnight, but out of the same discipline that had built his career. Document everything, judge nothing prematurely, and let the evidence speak when it was ready. His daughter, Maya, was 8, and she was the reason he noticed things other people missed. Since her mother passed 2 years earlier, David had rebuilt his mornings and evenings around her entirely school drop-off. The two of them making pancakes on Sundays, bedtime stories he sometimes invented on the spot when he was too tired to remember the ones from the books. He had every reason in the world to simply write a check to fix cross-dynamics problems and walk away. He didn't, because Maya was watching him build a life, and he wanted her to see that some problems were worth solving with your hands, not just your wallet. The warehouse crew didn't know any of that. To them, David was simply the new guy, quiet, competent, oddly calm, and therefore an easy target for people who mistook calm for weak. Trent Colby led that charge with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no in a way that stuck. He was 26, sharp-tongued, and universally understood by management to be a personality code. David quickly learned for someone whose bad behavior was tolerated because he hid his numbers and made the right jokes in front of the right people. The small cruelties started subtly. David's lunch, moved from the shared fridge to the counter, left out just long enough to spoil. His name, mispronounced deliberately in meetings, corrected once and then mispronounced again the next day, until the room started laughing along with the game instead of at the joke's cost. A rumor, started by no one in particular, and repeated by everyone eventually, that the new guy had been let go from his last 3 jobs. David let all of it happen. He watched who laughed loudest, who looked uncomfortable but said nothing, who quietly tried to make it right without drawing Trent's attention to themselves. He noticed a woman named Priya Anand who ran inventory control, always found a reason to walk past David's station around lunchtime with an extra granola bar she didn't want, never commenting on why. He noticed a 19-year-old stock associate named Jordan who flinched every time Preston raised his voice, the particular flinch of someone who had learned to expect it. He was building a map, not of the warehouse's shelving system, but of its soul. The turning point, the first real one, not the one the cameras would later capture, came in the 3rd week. On a Thursday that started like any other and ended with David standing in Preston's office, being told he was being written up for insubordination? The truth was almost absurdly small. A pallet had been improperly loaded by another associate, one of Trent's friends, and it had begun to shift dangerously in transit, nearly injuring a driver at the loading dock. David, the only one who noticed in time, had shouted a warning and physically redirected the pallet jack, preventing what could have been a serious injury. He had, in the process, bypassed the formal incident reporting chain by acting immediately instead of waiting for a supervisor. Preston didn't thank him. Preston needed a clean incident report that didn't implicate Trent's friend, and David's quick action had created a paper trail that pointed directly at unsafe loading practices under Preston's supervision. You went outside protocol, Preston said, sliding a written warning across the desk. I understand you meant well, but we have procedures for a reason. David read the warning twice. Then he signed it, not because he agreed with it, but because he understood, with the clarity of a man who had built companies from nothing, that some fights aren't won by refusing to sign a piece of paper. They're won by knowing exactly what that piece of paper will be worth later. He asked, politely, for a copy for his own records. Preston hesitated just half a second, the kind of hesitation that told David everything, before sliding it across. That night, after Maya was asleep, David sat at his kitchen table and opened his laptop. Not to complain to Elena, not yet. He wanted the full picture first, because half a story, even a true one, could be dismissed as one man's grudge. A complete one couldn't. He requested, through channels that existed specifically because he had built them, the warehouse's internal incident logs for the past 18 months. He cross-referenced them against HR's exit interviews, against the safety violation reports that had mysteriously never made it to corporate review, against the pattern of write-ups that always seemed to land on associates who had complained about Preston, and never once on the associates Preston golfed with on weekends. By the time he closed the laptop at midnight, he had 14 documented incidents where safety violations had been quietly buried, 3 where injured associates had been pressured not to file formal reports, and 1 especially damning email chain in which Preston had explicitly instructed a supervisor to manage the paperwork after a forklift accident that had sent a 22-year-old associate to the hospital with a fractured wrist. David didn't feel triumphant reading it. He felt tired and a little sick. The way you feel discovering that a house you'd hoped was merely in need of paint actually has rot in the foundation. The public humiliation, the one that would matter, the one that would end this, happened 2 days later. On the same morning, the badge scanner beeped red 3 times. It began small, the way these things always did. Trent, performing for an audience that now included 2 new hires he was clearly trying to impress, decided the morning needed a show. He waited until David was carrying a stack of return boxes across the floor, arms full, hands occupied, and stepped directly into his path. "Careful, boss," Trent said, using the nickname with exaggerated mockery, the kind that lands precisely because everyone in earshot knows it isn't real respect. "Some of us actually need this job." The boxes toppled. Not dramatically. David caught most of them, but enough that a few scattered across the floor. Enough that Trent's friends laughed. Enough that Preston, walking by at exactly that moment, chose not to intervene, chose instead to give David a look that said, "Clean it up and don't make this my problem." What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Elena Cross was standing in the mezzanine office, above the floor at that exact moment, having flown in that morning specifically to observe in person, because the footage from the past 3 weeks had left her unable to sit behind a desk in another city and simply read reports about it. She watched Trent step into David's path. She watched the boxes fall. She watched 60 employees on that floor either laugh, look away, or do nothing. And she watched David Marsh, a man who had once talked her through the worst boardroom crisis of her career without raising his voice, a man whose signature alone had kept this entire division employed, kneel down without a flicker of anger on his face and quietly begin picking up the boxes himself. That was the moment Elena Cross stopped observing and started walking. She didn't storm the floor, she didn't need to. She simply appeared at the top of the stairs, and the sound of her heels on the metal steps did more to silence the warehouse than any shout could have. Conversations died in stages, rippling outward from the stairwell like a stone dropped in still water, until the only sound left was the hum of the overhead lights and the soft rustle of David placing the last box back on the stack. "Preston," her voice was calm. It was always calm, which was precisely why people feared it more than shouting. "I'd like you and Trent to join me in the conference room. Now." Preston's smile, the one he used on regional calls, flickered and did not fully recover. "Of course, Miss Cross. Is there a problem?" "There's about to be a very thorough conversation about one," she said. "Bring your incident reports from the last 18 months. All of them." The walk to the conference room took 90 seconds. It felt to Preston like the longest 90 seconds of his professional life, though he did not yet understand why. Trent trailed behind, his earlier confidence visibly deflating with every step, the particular deflation of a young man who has just realized, for the first time, that consequences are real and that they had simply never found him before. David didn't follow immediately. He set the boxes down properly, checked that none of the returns had been damaged, and only then walked toward the stairs, unhurried, the same unreadable calm on his face that had unsettled Preston from his very first day. Inside the conference room, Elena didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, files already spread in front of her, files David had compiled and sent 2 nights earlier, files that were now printed, tabbed, and impossible to argue with. "I want to start," she said, with a question. "Preston, do you know who David Marsh is?" Preston's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, the only visible sign that the conversation had not unfolded the way he expected it would. "He's a temp associate. Started 3 weeks ago. He's the majority shareholder of Whitfield Capital," Elena said, letting the silence afterward do the work no explanation could. "Whitfield Capital owns 61% of this company. Which means, for the last 3 weeks, You've been supervising, disciplining, and publicly humiliating the man whose signature will decide whether this entire division still exists in 6 weeks. The color left Preston's face slowly, the way it does when someone is watching their entire understanding of a situation collapse and rebuild in real time. Trent, beside him, had gone very still. The stillness of someone doing frantic mental math on every joke he had made in the last 3 weeks and arriving at a number he did not like. "I want to be clear about something," David said. Speaking for the first time since entering the room, his voice as quiet as it had been on the floor. This was never a test of loyalty or a game to catch anyone. "I came here because Elena asked me to find out whether this division could be saved, and I needed to see it the way it actually runs, not the way it performs when leadership is watching. What I found had very little to do with me personally. It has everything to do with how this floor treats the people who have no shareholder papers to protect them." He slid a folder across the table, not the one with his own written warning, but a thicker one, the 14 buried incidents. The 3 pressured employees, the forklift accident, and the email that Red managed the paperwork. "A 22-year-old associate broke his wrist on this floor 11 months ago," David continued. "He was pressured not to file a formal report. I have the email where that pressure was applied. There are 2 more incidents like it, and 3 formal complaints from employees about a pattern of retaliation against anyone who raised safety concerns. None of it reached corporate review. All of it was buried at this table." Preston opened his mouth. "Nothing useful came out." "I'm not asking you to explain it here," Elena said. "HR and legal will have that conversation with you this afternoon. What I need from you right now is your badge." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet procedural ending of something that had been rotting for a long time, delivered in the same even tone David had used his entire life to end negotiations that mattered far more than this one ever would. Preston left the room without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any slam could have. Trent remained, visibly smaller than he had looked 20 minutes earlier on the warehouse floor. "I didn't know," he said, and it might even have been true, in the narrow, technical sense that he hadn't known David's name or his net worth. It was just jokes." "I know you didn't know who I was," David said, and something in his tone softened. Not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of the recognition that Trent was 26 and had learned his behavior from somewhere, likely from watching men like Preston get rewarded for exactly this kind of cruelty for years. "That's actually the point. Trent, you shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them like they matter." Trent didn't have an answer for that. Few people ever did, the first time someone said it to them plainly. He wasn't fired that day. Elena, at David's quiet suggestion, gave him something harder than termination, a mandatory transfer to a different site under a supervisor known for running the tightest, fairest floor in the company, along with a formal written warning that would follow him for a year, and a private conversation David had with him personally 2 weeks later, not as a shareholder, but as a father who had once been young and unkind before someone bothered to tell him plainly why it mattered. Whether it changed him permanently, no one could promise. But it gave him the chance to change, which was more than the old culture at Cross Dynamics had ever offered anyone. The investigation that followed took 6 weeks. It was thorough in the way David insisted it be, not a purge. Not a headline-driven overreaction, but a careful accounting of exactly how deep the rot had gone. 2 other supervisors in different regional warehouses were found to have run similar patterns of retaliation, uncovered only because the audit David requested widened, at his direction, to cover the entire logistics division rather than stopping conveniently at the one floor where he happened to be standing. Preya Anand, the inventory lead who had quietly left him granola bars without ever asking why, was offered Preston's position. She turned it down twice, uncertain. Before David sat with her for 20 minutes and told her the only qualification that mattered was one she already had. She'd been the only person on that floor who treated a stranger with decency before she had any reason to expect a reward for it. She took the job the following Monday. Jordan, the young associate who used to flinch at raised voices, became the first employee at Cross Dynamics enrolled in a new mentorship program David helped design, one built specifically to identify and support workers who had learned in previous jobs to expect to be treated badly, and to show them, deliberately and consistently, that it didn't have to be the standard. The badge scanner that had beeped red 3 times was replaced within the month, part of a wider infrastructure overhaul David funded personally rather than through the company's budget, quietly, without a press release, because he had learned long ago that the improvements that mattered most were rarely the ones anyone announced. Elena offered David a permanent seat on the operating board. He declined, the way he declined most formal titles throughout his life, preferring instead an informal arrangement that let him keep showing up unannounced in gray jackets, in places that needed watching more than they needed another executive with a corner office. 6 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday, David stopped by the warehouse floor again, this time with no disguise necessary since nearly everyone now knew exactly who he was. The break room had a new coffee machine, donated by an employee wellness fund that Priya had established in her first quarter running the floor. A framed photo hung near the entrance, not of David, which he'd specifically requested against, but of the entire floor crew, taken the week after Preston's departure, everyone smiling in a way that looked, for the first time in 18 months, unguarded. David's old written warning still sat in his desk drawer at home, the one Preston had made him sign for saving a driver from injury. He kept it there deliberately, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of exactly how easily a good workplace could rot if the people running it were never asked to answer for how they treated the ones with the least power to push back. Maya asked him once, months later, why he'd spent 3 weeks pretending to be someone he wasn't, mopping floors and carrying boxes when he could have simply hired someone to fix it from a distance. He thought about it for a long moment before answering, the way he thought about most things that mattered. Because the only way to know if a place is good, he told her, is to stand in it the way the people with no power have to stand in it. Everything else is just someone telling you what they think you want to hear. She didn't fully understand it then, not the way an 8-year-old understands most things adults say to sound wise. But she kept the sentence anyway, the way children do with the pieces of their parents that eventually become the shape of who they grow up to be. The warehouse ran differently after that sprint. Not perfectly, because no place run by people ever does, but honestly, in the way that only comes from an organization finally willing to look at its own worst habits without flinching. New hires were told, on their first day, about the safety reporting line that actually got answered now, about the mentorship program, about the fair, transparent process for raising concerns without fear of retaliation. Almost none of them were told the story of the quiet man in the gray jacket who had once carried a stack of boxes across that floor while 60 people watched and did nothing. David preferred it that way. The story was never meant to be about him. It was meant to be about what a place becomes when someone finally decides to notice, and about the fact that dignity should never have to wait for someone to discover who you really are before it's offered freely to everyone, every single day.